religion as the daily practices of ritual. Now, what is interesting about this? What comes through with this is another theme, another subtype of a very mild version of a psychiatric disorder, which once again works spectacularly when you get it just right, not now with the metamagical big theology building blocks of religion, but the daily bits and pieces of ritualism. And this brings in another psychiatric disorder, one we haven't talked about much in class so far. Okay, I guarantee on a regular basis, all of us in this room getting to some point where it's some anxious period, you've got some major deadline, you're applying for some summer something or other that you really want to get, you're totally uptight about it, you're sitting down and you're writing the essay, and before you can write the essay, you've got to get your favorite pen, and it's got to be right there, and you've got to rearrange your desk, and you've got to get everything sorted out, and finally you finish it, and you go mail off the application, you put it in the mailbox, and you check again to make sure it went down, and this is really important, you don't want to so you check again, just to make sure, and you're all set for that, and you finally... There's no one else around, so you go and you look in front of it and look in back of it and that sort of thing. I mean, we all do this. Actually, maybe we don't all do this, and I'm embarrassing myself horribly. But my bet is most of us do this sort of thing. We fall into obsessive little rituals during times of anxiety. We also have rituals, intrusive thoughts that just invade our heads at times where they are of no obvious purpose. They are at the cost of thinking anything more clearly. It's totally maddening, and you can't stop the thoughts. For example, today I am working on a paper that's involving all sorts of very deep ruminative thought and figuring out all sorts of data stuff, and I've made no progress on it at all this morning because for some reason that I don't understand at all of today I've had the damn theme song from Teletubbies going through my head. And I can't stop it, especially the part where Lala leaps up and says Lala, the really cute part there, and I can't stop doing this. And I don't know what's going on. I did not plan to lose today's productivity because of Teletubbies, but we get this some stupid jingle that's stuck in your head. You find yourself going up a flight of stairs and you can't stop yourself from counting the steps. We do this. We all do this. And we tend to do it more often during periods of anxiety. And the interpretation of that is that we impose this totally arbitrary, useless, destructive structure at a time when everything else feels like you're walking on quicksand. We all do this as some sort of adaptation to periods of anxiety. And what we transition into now is talking about a psychiatric disorder where people do this all the time. And it not only gets in the way of them getting some work done on a project that requires some concentration, this is a disorder that absolutely destroys their lives. This is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And the full-blown version of it bears so little resemblance to what any of us do when we are having to get the pen right and checking the mailbox the third time and having the jingle go through your head for a while. It is of such a scale larger. It is so much more destructive. It is virtually unimaginable from our perspective. People with OCD have their lives completely destroyed by this disorder. People with OCD in the full-blown version spend 6 hours a day washing their hands. The characteristic that's always at the top of the list with OCD is this obsessive focusing on hygiene, this worry that you are constantly in some way soiled. 6 hours a day of washing. These are people who cannot hold down jobs, their marriages come apart, their relationships are destroyed because they cannot stop washing. And you have in the reader one profile of somebody with OCD from a book entitled The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing. This is the symptom that always pops up at the top of the list, and the actual washing process is ritualistic beyond belief. These are people who have bought 7 different kinds of antibacterial soap. They go through this whole sequence. The water has to be a certain temperature for the first level of washing, then a certain type of towel that they dry themselves off with. That towel has to be put out of the room because it's dirty then the next layer of washing with the next soap. Go through 2 hours of this. They're finally done. Turn to leave to go to their job, go to their whatever, and on the way out, brush their elbow against the door, and they have to start all over again. And you will stop them at that point and say, you will miss this interview, you will not get this job, and they will say, yes, I know, but I'm not going to be able to function and it's dirty. I know my elbow, I know I'm going to touch it then, and then I'll get it in my face, and I just have to start over. I'm not going to be able to get anything done today anyway, so I need to go wash. If I don't wash, I'm not going to be able to do it. And back they go, and hours of this. People with OCD spend half their waking hours doing this. People with OCD just have constant sequences of numbers going in their heads, constant jingles, intrusive thoughts. They cannot stop thinking, what if I don't stop the car at the next stop sign? What if I run down this person? They have the intrusive thoughts of, I'm absolutely sure I struck somebody at that street crossing back there. I've got to go back and check. Okay, they don't see anybody there. They drive on 5 miles down the road. Probably the person flew off into the bushes. I have to go back and check. I have to go back and check. They can never leave their home because they've left the door unlocked. They go back, they check, the door is locked. They have to go back. They left the gas on. They left the light on. This is absolutely paralyzing. Intrusive thoughts. What if I leaned over and struck the person next to me? What if somebody kills my loved ones? You can't stop the thoughts. They just keep coming at these people. They cannot enter or leave a place. There is a paralysis about entering and leaving built around this sort of almost magical exclusionary power that you get a transition into a place. They cannot enter a room until they do a prime number of tappings on the wall before entering. They can then not enter the room until that's prime number, and then a different prime number with their left foot shaking. Completely arbitrary symptoms of having to enter and leave. Numerology, these people cannot begin a meal until the utensils are absolutely symmetrical and lined up, and they're never perfectly symmetrical. And the entering and leaving ritual is never done right, and they certainly can't enter the classroom unless the number of steps from here to the door is 2 times an interval that's with this, a very mathematical quality to it, and it's never quite right, and you've got to do it all over again. And what's been pointed out, one of the really interesting sort of insights as to what OCD is about is that this is an anxiety disorder. This is a pathological attempt to impose structure, to impose predictability, to impose control in a world where everything is pathologically provoking of a sense of dis-ease and uncertainty and anxiety. And the absolute horrifying version of OCD that I've heard described is this metaphor where this is straight out of ethology. This is a fixed action pattern. We all know the fixed action pattern of a dog is settling down at night on its blanket, and what does the dog do? It circles a few times before it settles down, but then it circles a couple of more times, and just as it's ready to, and then it circles a few more, and you can see at some point the dog doesn't even want to do this anymore. And it takes a while longer, and another 30 seconds before the dog can finally escape from this fixed action pattern and sit down. In OCD, the person never, ever escapes. The person spends forever circling on the blanket, being unable to finally lie down and rest because they are just consumed with these rituals, with these obsessive, intrusive thoughts. And what you get is, this is completely paralyzing. Okay, here's an example of an obsessive belief that we all have. Okay, can anybody identify this? Okay, here's what it is. This is an aerial view. In fact, it's a satellite photograph of here. This is a tray of Rice Krispie treats. And you've just walked into the room, and it looks like this. And for a huge percentage of us, within a minute or so, it's going to look like this. Because we all feel this compulsive need to take a knife and cut off that edge. Okay, let me just canvass you on all of that. Okay, how many of you do this for starters? I certainly do. Okay, how many of you of those who do this cut off this bit here because it doesn't really count on your diet? Okay, a couple of hands. How many of you cut it off because what's perfectly obvious is going from this to this decreases the total perimeter so that it will stay fresher that way? Okay? Problems there. How many of you wind up doing it because it's just getting at you that the knife's just there and you just have to cut it off and smooth out the edge? Yes, that's why we all do it. And then what you then decide is that there's this little bump here which requires you to trim this out, and then there's the little bump, and off you go with that. And we all wind up doing that. But if this is what you did around the clock for your entire life, it would destroy it. And what is most striking with people with OCD is you could never go through the sequence I just did. There's no insight. The person does not sit there and say, help, there's something wrong with me. I feel this need to wash my hands 6 hours a day. They say, help, there's something wrong with me. I can never get clean. I'm just so dirty. Everything I do makes me dirty. There's no insight into it. Okay, so where does this fit in? Again, our modern version of religion, our modern, very secularly influenced version of religion, so often involves an emphasis on what religion is about is counseling the troubled. What religion is about is holding the hands of the newlyweds and making sure they understand what they're getting into. What religion is about is comforting the bereaved. What religion is about is the good works. But this is not what religion has often been about throughout history. Often, the religious leaders are not necessarily the ones who are most psychotherapeutically minded or the most galvanizing of people into the good works. Often, religious leaders have been the ones at the head of a crusade. Often, religious leaders have been the ones with the most vivid images of what hell and damnation would be like. But often, what religious leaders have been are the people who are best at doing the rituals. And that has been another thread of religious practice throughout history, of religious leaders as often being among the most fervent, the most accomplished at carrying out of rituals. Now, let me give you a sense of this, because as I began to read more on this, this absolutely astonished me, because I knew very little about this stuff, just the scale of this. And starting off with what will probably be a fairly alien religion for most of you in here, and then moving into examples closer to home. Looking at orthodox, very traditional Hinduism, looking at the behaviors of a Brahmin, an individual who devotes their entire life to ritualistic practice in pursuit of their religion. A Brahmin, a highly observant Brahmin, spends 6 hours a day in cleansing rituals. And there are detailed rules as to which hand you wash in what sequence, how many times you wash each hand separately, how many each one together, the sequence with which you wash out one side of your mouth versus the other with water. There are set rules for Brahmins as to how you are supposed to lie down at night, dictating what your first sight is in the morning. There are set rules as to what direction you must face when defecating in terms of what you are looking at the time. There are set rules for rituals you have to do when entering a temple, when leaving a temple. There are set rules for how many breaths you take through each nostril. You close one nostril during your prayers for a certain number of breaths, then you close the other. And all of these are very carefully stipulated. The number of mouthfuls of food, the number of times you chew per mouthful, the number of prayers you have to say per day, sequences of magic numbers, all of this is absolutely spelled out, and Orthodox Brahmins consume their entire days doing this. Okay, next example, Orthodox Judaism. Spectacularly, yeah, question? A couple of questions that just came up. How come people with OCD don't come down with learned helplessness? Why aren't they depressed? Because part of the fuel behind OCD is you're always convinced, aha, one more. Now I know, instead of doing it 17 times, 18. If I do it 18, then it's going to be perfect. You've always just figured out, not only do I have to do the 6 hours of washing, but make sure I never step on a crack, and then I won't break my mother's back. You're always figuring out the next step. Then pointing out, we're about to go in a direction where what are the advantages of a mild version of OCD, and we're discussing this in a religious context. I should point out, in a secular context, there's a tremendous advantage to a mild version of OCD. What it does is get you into a place like Stanford. What it does is work to a tremendous advantage, given how regimented and disciplined a lot of folks are in here. Get it in the right context, blah, blah, that theme that we have again and again. Okay, shifting over, just seeing Orthodox Brahmin belief in Hinduism absolutely dominated virtually full time with ritualistic behaviors. Orthodox Jewry, a spectacular number of laws built around food preparation, the kosher laws, very detailed rules as to how long of a time interval between eating one type of food and another type of food. If you inadvertently mix up the silverware with different types of food, ritualistic cleansing rituals that you have to go through involving putting the utensils in dirt for months on end, and special prayers that have to be said, rules about how you enter and leave a holy place, involving certain prayers, involving a certain ritualistic touching that you have to make on the door jamb there. All sorts of magic numbers. The number 18 has magical powers in Orthodox Judaism, and it's built around numbers of times you have to say a prayer, multiples of 18.